Є Є малесенька вірогідність, що запис сьогодні не вдасться зробити повністю, але я дуже постараюся, щоб цього уникнути через можливі відключення світла. Да? Тобто, якщо світло може відключитися, то не весь запис у нас буде доступний, але незважаючи на це, незважаючи на проблеми із доєднанням одного з лекторів, незважаючи на проблеми із електроенергією в Україні, я дуже рада вітати вас всіх сьогодні на нашому семінарі, присвяченому дитячому горюванню після раптової чи насильницької втрати. Я дуже рада з причин, хоча у нас дуже сумна тема, але ми маємо сьогодні чудову команду спеціалістів, з якими ми довго перебували у контакті, щоб зробити можливою цю лекцію. І тому я дуже рада вітати сьогодні Стівена Коцу, Грегорі Лескіна, Крістін Оглі і наших двох лекторок, які будуть представляти тему сьогоднішнього нашого вебінару. Це доктор Алісія Ліберман, та вона до нас доєднається трошечки згодом. Алісія має невеличкі труднощі з доєднанням. Алісія працює завідувачкою кафедри психічного здоров'я немовлят імені Ірвінга Гарріса. Вона також є професоркою кафедри психіатрії та поведінкових наук UCSF та директоркою програми дослідження дитячої травми. Вона працює клінічним консультантом Агентства соціальних служб Сан-Франциско для дітей в системі соціального захисту. Нам дуже пощастило мати сьогодні її за лекторку та побачити її сфера і практичних, і наукових інтересів обгортається навколо теми дитячої травми. І я з радістю представляю вам нашу першу лекторку сьогодні. Це Джулі Каплоу. Вона є докторкою філософії, ліцензованим клінічним психологом і сертифікованою в галузі клінічної дитячої та підліткової психології. Працює доценткою на кафедрі педіатрії в медичному коледжі Бейлора в Техаській дитячій лікарні в Х'юстоні та ад'юнкт-професором у відділенні паліативної допомоги в онкологічному центрі доктора Андерсона. Так, трошечки ми, overwhelmed всіми регаліями, тому я передаю слово пані Джулії і сподіваюся, що є у неї можливість поділитися екраном. Julie, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And I really am honored to be here, especially given the amazing work that all of you are doing. I'm in awe of what you're having to do on the front lines there, and truly honored to be part of this. And I'm also very thrilled to be presenting with Alicia Lieberman, who happens to be one of my personal and professional heroes. So thank you for having me. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. And I'm assuming everyone can see that. Great. Okay, so today what I'm going to be talking about is using evidence-based practices to support youth who've experienced bereavement and traumatic loss. I'm going to be focusing on kids really ages 7 and up, whereas Alicia is going to be focusing on younger children under the age of 7. And I do want to just mention that I'm going to be talking about a couple of different treatments today. One is called trauma and grief component therapy. The other is called multidimensional grief therapy. And another assessment tool that I will likely mention is called the prolonged grief disorder checklist. And I want to start by just defining bereavement. And I know that so many of you know what this means, but bereavement is the experience of deprivation or loss by death whereas grief is the psychological or behavioral response that arises from bereavement. So in other words, bereavement is to trauma as grief is to PTSD. And I'll say that one more time because I think it's an important distinction. Bereavement is to trauma as grief is to PTSD. And what's interesting is that we know a lot about the impact of bereavement on children. We know far less about the impact of grief on children. So how are they actually reacting to the loss? And that's something that we're actively studying and pursuing at our Trauma and Grief Center. So why are we focused on bereavement? Bereavement is actually the most frequently reported type of trauma in clinic-referred youth. So when kids report to an outpatient clinic or setting, this is most often what they are reporting is in terms of a bad thing or terrible thing that has happened to them. It's also the most common form of trauma worldwide. So anyone across the world, this is the most common adversity. It is also the most distressing form of trauma among adults and youth in the general population. So if you were to ask anybody, what is the hardest thing that's ever happened to you? The vast majority would say it was the death of my loved one. And finally, at least in the United States, it is the strongest predictor of poor school outcomes above and beyond any other form of trauma. And this includes things like sexual abuse, physical abuse, witnessing violence. And what we found in this study is that the sudden death of a loved one was the strongest predictor of poor school grades, school dropout, lack of school connectedness, problems learning, above and beyond any other form of trauma. And that's why we're also so passionate about ensuring that schools and teachers really understand the impact of sudden loss on children. And although we're talking about bereavement right now, one of the most important takeaways from this lecture today is that it's actually children's grief reactions, not just bereavement, that play a very important role in their future psychological functioning. So again, it's not just about the death itself, it's about how they're reacting to the death. And so along these lines, my colleagues and I, Chris Lane and Bob Pynus, have worked for over a decade on really trying to better understand how grief manifests in children of different ages. And what we find is that grief is multidimensional, meaning that grief is not, it's not as if you either have or don't have maladaptive grief. It's that you can be high or low in any of these dimensions, and I'm going to describe what those are. So the first is separation distress. This is yearning and longing for the person who died. The next is existential or identity distress. This is feeling lost without the person, or how am I going to get through life without the person here? And the third is circumstance-related distress. And this is being very preoccupied with the way the person died. I wish so I wish I hadn't, I wish they didn't have to suffer so much, or I wish I could have intervened. And within each of these dimensions, there is an adaptive counterpart. And what I mean by that is that, for example, with separation distress, I was working with a young girl whose mother died of cancer, and her mother was like her best friend. They were very close. And so, of course, she was extremely distressed when her mother died and was missing her a great deal. But the more that she engaged in behaviors that she used to do with her mom, the more she felt connected to her mother, obviously in a very different way, but in a healthy way. So she started making her mom's favorite apple pie. She started to take swim lessons because that was something that her mom and her used to love doing together. And again, the more she engaged in those behaviors, the more connected she felt in a healthy way. That would be the adaptive side of separation distress. With existential or identity distress, we hear from teenagers all the time, I don't know how I'm going to get through life without my dad. But we also hear those same people saying things like, I want to live the kind of life my dad would have wanted me to live, or I want to do things that would have made my dad proud of me. That is the adaptive side of existential or identity distress. And with circumstance-related distress, what we see very often is that kids will naturally gravitate toward wanting to change the circumstances of the death into something that can help benefit other people so that they don't have to suffer in the same way. So, for example, we see this even in younger children. So, I was working with a 9-year-old whose father died in a tragic plane crash. And when I asked him, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" He said, "I want to be an engineer so I can make planes that don't break anymore." And we see this all the time where kids will naturally want to, again, transform the circumstances into something that can help others. So, for example, I want to become an ER doctor because I want to save people's lives the way that I wish they would have saved my brother. Or I want to raise money for breast cancer because my mom died of breast cancer. And so when we're thinking about how best to help children who are grieving, what we want to do is not only focus on reducing the distress, but also harnessing or growing those more adaptive grief reactions. And the reason we think this multidimensional framework is so important is because different dimensions of grief may be more prominent at certain developmental stages. So, for example, what we find is that younger children under the age of 12 tend to have higher levels of separation distress, whereas older kids or adolescents tend to have higher levels of existential or identity distress, which makes sense if you think about the developmental tasks of each of those age groups. Different dimensions of grief may also not be present in all bereaved populations. So, one thing we find is that kids who experience homicide death or are in communities where homicide is more prevalent, those are the kids that tend to have higher levels of circumstance related distress. And finally, different dimensions of grief may require different treatment components. And this is probably the most important aspect that we'll talk about today is that the way we support kids who are really suffering with their separation distress, so really missing the person, looks very different than how we support kids who are very immersed in the circumstances of the death and can't stop thinking about how they died. So we're going to talk more about that in a minute. I also really want to just touch on grief in the context of ambiguous loss, which we know is happening all across the world, but especially in war-torn countries. And what we find is that ambiguous loss differs from ordinary loss in that there is no verification of the death. So the person is missing, but we don't know where they are or if they're alive. There is no certainty that they will come back, and there's no guarantee that things will return to the way they used to be. And we see these very same grief reactions in kids who are suffering from ambiguous loss. So, preoccupation with the person's absence, and we hear questions like, when is dad coming back? When can I see him again? And they are very much immersed in that separation distress. With existential distress, we see and hear this all the time from kids where the person is missing. I don't even know who I am anymore without him here, wanting the person to come back to feel like they have their identity back. And then circumstance related distress, again, kids can be very preoccupied with the circumstances of what made the person go missing. So I can't stop thinking about where he might be right now. Is he okay? And so those are just some examples, but this is to say that the interventions and practice elements that I'm going to talk about in just a minute all apply to ambiguous loss as much as they apply to the death of a loved one. I do want to talk very briefly about links that we're seeing between bereavement and suicide risk, because this is another very important outcome that we often see in bereaved youth. And what we find is that many kids experience what we call reunification fantasies. This is when they fantasize about being reunited with the person in an afterlife, whether that's heaven or something else. And again, this depends heavily on the child's own spiritual beliefs. But this is an example taken from one of our treatments called trauma and grief component therapy. And this is a girl whose best friend died. And she is thinking to herself, it doesn't matter if I live or die. If I crash the car, the bad news is I'm dead. But the good news is I get to see my friend again. And we hear this all the time from adolescents in particular. So the important thing is to recognize that this is a very normal response, that kids do have reunification fantasies quite frequently. But the important aspect is to really assess to make sure that they don't actually have a plan, that they're not actually going to try to hurt themselves. So this is something to be aware of in bereaved youth. And then the other piece of this is really thinking carefully about other risk factors in the context of bereavement that can lead to suicide risk. So Joyner's theory, called interpersonal psychological theory of suicide, basically says that there needs to be two primary factors present in order for someone to die by suicide. And the first is thwarted belongingness. And this means a sense of loneliness or perceived lack of support. And the second risk factor is perceived burdensomeness. This is when one feels that they are a drain on other people. And what we find is that among bereaved children, these are very common. And in fact, these are direct quotes from kids who have lost a loved one. And what we hear are things like nobody understands me. No one knows what this is like to not have a dad anymore or not have a mom anymore. People think I'm weird because I don't have a mom anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone I get close to dies. I shouldn't get close to anyone anymore. And all of this leads to that feeling of thwarted belongingness. And again, this is something we see quite frequently in bereaved youth. The second factor comes up all the time as well. Mom starts to cry every time I mention how much I miss dad, therefore she'd be better off without me. Or if I had been better behaved in school, mom wouldn't have been so stressed and had a heart attack and died. And so kids can actually create narratives in their mind about how they were responsible for the person's death, which leads to more of that sense of perceived burdensomeness. These are all examples to just keep in mind when working with bereaved youth, because we know that these are very prominent predictors of suicide risk. And so the question becomes, how do we support grieving youth? And I'm going to just touch on a couple of different treatment aspects to be thinking about. So most of these come directly from a newer intervention that we recently developed called multidimensional grief therapy. And this is an assessment-driven intervention based on the theory that I just mentioned earlier, multidimensional grief theory. It is designed to both promote adaptive grief reactions and reduce unhelpful grief reactions. And to our knowledge, it is the first evidence-based, grief-focused intervention for children and adolescents that directly addresses all three of those primary domains that I mentioned earlier. It also addresses the interplay between trauma and grief that we'll touch on, and I know Alicia is also going to talk about this. It provides a continuum of grief-informed care, because you'll see in a minute that we use a tiered approach where basically the first phase of the intervention can be administered by any caring adult. They do not have to be a mental health professional. The second phase of the treatment is only delivered by mental health professionals. And we did this intentionally, knowing that where children seek care in the aftermath of a death is not necessarily running to their therapist. It is often in the context of their faith-based community, their after-school program, their teachers. So we want every caring adult to know how to best support a grieving child. And then finally, it can be used individually or in groups. And when we did a deeper dive to really look at what are the core elements of grief interventions across the board, first of all, there are very few grief interventions across the board. Many of them are embedded in trauma-focused treatments. But what we found is that there tend to be 7 core elements that are common among grief or trauma-focused treatments that address grief. And I'm not going to talk about all of these today in the interest of time, but I want to touch on just some of them. So the first is grief psychoeducation. And when we're working with children, we don't show them that fancy graphic with the 3 dimensions of grief. What we talk about are these grief characters who can help them to better understand what they're feeling and put words to those experiences. So we talk about lost and lonely Leo. This is identity distress. This is a child who really doesn't know how he's going to get through life without his person anymore after they've died. And in contrast, we talk about meaning-making Marcus. So what are the things that he can do to live the legacy of the person who died, or to make that person proud of him? And we use these as examples of how a child can be immersed in more of that grief that keeps them stuck or having trouble functioning. And at the same time, they can have those more adaptive grief reactions. And what we want to do is help them to start feeling more and more like meaning-making Marcus and not lost and lonely Leo. We also do a lot of emotion regulation activities where we help kids to identify their feelings and to recognize that it is perfectly normal to have multiple feelings at once about the death of their loved one. We also do a lot of cognitive coping activities. And for many of you who are familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, this is really just helping them to think about how their thoughts lead to certain feelings, which lead to certain behaviors, and how if they can change those thoughts, they can actually change their feelings and behaviors. We call it a helping a friend activity because what we do is we ask the child to look at the cartoon and pretend like the person in the cartoon is a good friend. And what is the advice they would give that good friend? So for example, this is a girl whose father recently died. She has a new stepfather who's sitting at the table. And she's thinking, that's dad's chair. Who does he think he is? He will never be my dad. What we've done in multidimensional grief therapy is we've tried to provide scenarios that are very common among bereaved children to help them to think about how can I change that thought so that I don't feel so distressed anymore. So one alternative thought might be, well, maybe he just needs to learn more about my dad. Maybe that's something I can talk to him about. Or he doesn't have to replace my dad. I can still love my dad, but maybe make room for a new relationship. So these are all things that we help kids to really think about as they're processing their grief. And this leads me to grief processing. So many of you may be familiar with trauma processing, which is where we typically do a very deep dive into the circumstances surrounding the death, right? So what actually killed the person. With a grief processing framework, what we're really doing is putting that into context, but really honing in on the different dimensions of grief. So chapter 1, where we start, is thinking all about the person who died. What do they miss the most? And that taps into the separation distress. Chapter 3, how I stay connected. How can they still feel connected to the person? Chapter 4, how the person died. This is really where we're starting to get into the trauma narrative component. But notice that that's only one chapter of the entire grief processing. So really, the circumstances of the death make up only a small component of the types of grief reactions that the kids are typically experiencing. So we go on, I won't get into the details of those other chapters, but this is all to say that with grief processing, we are really looking at the whole range of grief reactions that kids have, not just focusing on the post-traumatic stress or trauma that they may have experienced at the time of the death. Finally, memorializing and continuing bonds. This is such an important aspect. And for many of the kids, what we want to do is really harness what are their spiritual beliefs, what are their beliefs about how they can still feel connected to the person. And that can be simply memorializing them by planting a flower or doing something in their honor. Or it can literally be harnessing some of their more protective spiritual beliefs. And this is an example. This was a little girl whose father died very suddenly. And she drew a picture of her father in heaven. And you can see in the picture, he's playing cards with his own father who has died. And he's also in his reclining chair with a TV remote control. And on the TV, it's a little hard to see, but on the TV, there is only what she called the family channel. And the family channel is only of her own family in real time. And so basically, her dad is watching her and her family all the time. And there's a tiny little sign to the left that says "to real life." And whenever he is needed, whenever there's a special event, whenever there's something that they need him for, he can fly down in spirit form and be with the family. And I just thought to myself, what a perfect and poignant example of how kids can make these beliefs into something that can actually be protective and helpful over the longer term. And then the last component that I'll just mention, and then I'm going to turn it over to Alicia, is caregiver grief facilitation. This is such an important piece. We know that caregivers are the primary facilitators of children's grief. And what we've learned is that some positive parenting behaviors, like keeping routines, positive reinforcement, active listening, are associated with decreased distress in bereaved children. But what we've also learned is that it's not so much about what the parents are saying, but what they're doing that's most important. So what we find is that there are specific behaviors that are associated with decreased maladaptive grief and depression. And these are very simple behaviors like physical affection, hugging the child, smiling at the child, maintaining good eye contact. And really what this comprises is being fully present for that child. That may seem very simple, but for a caregiver who is also grieving, this is incredibly difficult. It means bearing witness to the child's pain and needing to put their own pain aside to be fully present for the child. And it is hard to do, but it is something that we have worked with parents to be able to do. And the more they're able to listen with an open heart and an open mind to the child, that is really what seems to be the most predictive in terms of reducing distress in the children. And I will pause there. For anyone who is interested in more trainings that we do at our Trauma and Grief Center, you can hover over that QR code. And we will also, I also just want to mention that we have a Tag Center website where you can go to download handouts for parents about how to help their grieving child. And thank you so much for listening, and I will stop sharing.
No, um, let me, it is shared here. And can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So you heard everything you needed to hear from Julie's presentation. I will build on it in terms of our experience with children who lost their parents in the first years of life. And here I want to remind you of the importance of attachment, particularly in the first years of life, when the child's sense of self, who they are, is built around who loves them, who takes care of them, who is teaching them about how the world works. Children turn to the mother, the father, the grandparent as a source of protection in situations of distress and fear. And we know that fear is built into the most early developing parts of the brain, and the brain centers that register fear or safety are active from the moment of birth. How the attachment figure responds to the fear gives the child the message, my fear is tolerable. I can manage it. I can turn to somebody that will keep me protected and safe. And when that message is not present, even little children experience what Julie called existential distress. It's a feeling of, who am I? Who will keep me alive? Who will take care of me? But it's very hard to really identify with the fears of young children because they are expressed non-verbally, and they are expressed through behaviors that are often very difficult to regulate. When a baby cries inconsolably, and we cannot stop the crying, or when a toddler has a temper tantrum that goes on and on and on, and nothing that we do stops it, it brings us in touch with our own helplessness to control the world, to control our feelings. It brings us back to when our cries were not heard, when we were not protected. And then we go back to a time of helplessness that is enacted in our relationship with the child. And then the child gets the message, my feelings are unbearable and nobody can help me. And this is, I think, the existential crisis that happens when a young child loses an attachment figure. Who will be there for me? Who will give me a sense of continuity in my sense of self? And adults often underestimate the impact of the loss on the young child, partly as a form of self-protection. I think all cultures have developed a protective mechanism that babies are too little to understand what happened, to feel what happened. They are resilient, they forget, they recover quickly. And actually, the earlier the loss and the less response there is to the loss, the more likely it is to have lifelong consequences in terms of depression, lack of trust in relationships, a sense of hopelessness, a sense of lack of competence. And part of it is that the brain, the neural connections that create the architecture of the brain, the structure of the brain, are formed most quickly in the first 5 years of life. And those neural connections are like templates that set the stage for the rest of the brain development. And so the expectations that young children have in the first 5 years of life are expectations that are lasting. And the very classic studies of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth show that very young babies show separation distress that can be separated into 3 phases. And we are finding the same phases in response to the parent's death. One is protest, the initial response of crying, distress, searching, and rejecting any substitutes. We had a 8-month-old whose mother died, who refused to be fed by anybody else. His loving grandma could not feed him. And they had to resort to the bottle again, often when he was falling asleep. And what eventually helped was to put a photo of the mother next to the dish of food and say, Mama is here looking, and she is here helping Abuela, helping Grandma feed you. And then the grandma sang a song that the mom used to sing to the baby. And that helped bring the mom back and reconnect the baby with the wish to eat. But it takes enormous creativity to think of how do we go around the unspoken feeling of the baby to connect with what the baby needs. And as Julie said, and I will repeat this again, that means also that the substitute caregiver, the new caregiver, needs to come to grips with her own grief in order to turn herself over to the baby. And in the treatment that I am going to describe in a little bit, much of our work involves helping the new caregiver process their own grief. Very often, we have individual sessions with the caregiver to help them cry, to help them scream in despair and in anger at the death of the parent, and then connect with how hard it is to be available for the crying child when their own crying is still so acute. And so the treatment that we do is simultaneous for the new caregiver and for the child. Want to go back to the faces that we see, because after the protest often comes a sense of hopelessness and lethargy, what Bowlby called despair, where there is a muteness, a yearning that is mute. We had a little girl, for example, that would go and sit silently next to the door and just sat there with an expression of profound sadness. And every time the bell rang, she would perk up. And then when she saw that it wasn't the parent, she would go back to her helplessness. And with children that do not get a new attachment figure to take care of them, what we often find is a phase of detachment. It's like I'm disconnected from the memory because it is too difficult. And those children might not recognize a photo of the parent, for example, because that, even though they recognize the photos of everybody else, so we know that it is a meaningful non-recognition, that it is emotionally driven. All these phases are made more difficult in the first 3-4 years of life, because before the age of 4, children don't recognize the finality of death. And one of the most painful tasks of therapists is to help the new caregivers tell the child, you want so much for your daddy to come back. You want so much for your mommy to come back, but they won't come back. They want to come back. They didn't want to die. They loved you so much, and they did not want to die, but they can't come back because their body is not working. And we talk in very graphic terms about what death means in order to help them accept the finality of death. And as Julie said, there are constant efforts to bring the parent back. For example, children will say, and my mommy will come to my birthday. And there is such a wish on the part of the surviving caregivers to say, yes, your mommy will come. And what we have to say is, oh, you want your mommy to come, but she can't come. She can't come, but we can put balloons and say, Mommy, look at the balloons. And we can talk to her wherever she is. And the question of where the parent is something that reminds me of a saying that we have in our program, which is the story grows as the child grows. Something that we say to 2-year-olds is not the same thing that we say to 4-year-olds, or is not the same thing that we say to 5-year-olds. So children start asking more questions as they are cognitively trying to understand what happened. And then we can add more details, including what are the spiritual beliefs of the family about where the parent is. I want to just, this slide really recapitulates what Julie said before and what I said before, and that all adults are affected by the death. And so we need to really have a family approach to keep in mind the entire family when we think about how to help the child. And the manifestations of grief in young children are persistent fatigue, loss of energy, depressed affect, lack of interest in age-appropriate activities. We see a lot of recklessness, endangering themselves. And some children will say at age 3, I want to die to be with my daddy. I want to die, which is the early origin of suicidal ideations. And then we have to give them the message of your mommy doesn't want you to die. They want you to grow up and be an old person because she did not want to die. And she wants you to grow up and be big and strong and have your own children when you want to. So constantly the message of protection and the message of nobody could help the death, not the doctor, not the soldiers, not the strong people that were trying to keep, because children tend to blame themselves, and we need to counter those harmful beliefs to give them a sense of realistic cause and effect. There are a lot of similarities in the PTSD and grief reaction in particularly in early childhood. You will have these slides, so I will not go through them in the interest of time. But I think that one of the most important things to remember is the role of play and how play can tell us how the child is processing the death. For example, there is a child whose mother died in a car accident, and where he was also there, so he saw the mother's death. And very often, the trauma of seeing how the parent dies interferes with the grief reaction because the child is avoiding remembering the circumstance of the death. In this case, this child could not see cars. He screamed whenever he saw a car. And in play, we had a truck and a school bus, which resembled cars, but were not exactly the same as cars. And the child started enacting the crash with the school bus and with the truck again and again. And then the therapist in the 5th session put a car on the side to see whether the child could get to it. And the child took the car and threw it away and said, don't bring it. And that gave us the message that he wasn't ready yet. But she kept bringing the car and putting it to the side because it was an important component of the everyday life of the child. There are cars everywhere. So it was building progressive desensitization, and the child started playing with the car and then putting it away, and then eventually enacted the accident with the car. And after he was able to express how much he missed his mother, and we could move to the grieving part. The from dissociation, he could come to integration. So in child-parent psychotherapy, we think of it as a two-generation approach where we are providing treatment jointly in joint sessions to the parent and to the child. And we look at development, we look at cultural beliefs, spiritual beliefs, rituals, and the role of attachment. What are the false beliefs, the harmful beliefs of I made it happen, she died because I am bad, which go really deeply into ourselves and can change our sense of self. And using also cognitive behavioral strategies of active intervention. We start by meeting alone with the caregiver to find out what are the circumstances of the death. What did the child witness? What does the child know? What was the child told? What are the current circumstances? What changed since the death? And what was the quality of the relationship between the child and the parent who died, and who is taking care of the child now? And in that foundational phase, we start making the interventions with the caregiver that we think are going to be useful for the child. And then one of the things that we use is something called the traumatic event screening inventory, which is a list of traumatic events that often happen in children's lives. And the reason we do that is because when we get a referral, very often we're told about one trauma that happened to the child, for example, the parent's death. But when we ask what else happened to the child, on average, there are 5 traumatic stresses that happened to the child before the parent's death that nobody thought of asking. And that can involve accidents or injuries or maltreatment or witnessing domestic violence or community violence, sources of stress and trauma that in the moment of the death, nobody's thinking about, but we know already shape how the child is experiencing the world. And we also do trauma symptoms, but asking the caregiver helps and watching the child helps. I know that in circumstances of war, it's very hard to do structured interviews. And so this is just to show what the research shows in terms of improvement. And we also try to find time to ask the caregiver, what have you gone through? What is your history? What do you bring to this story? Because what happened to the caregiver influences how the caregiver is relating to the child. And when available, we also use structures. At the end of the foundational phase, we talk to the caregiver about what is the relationship between what happened to the child and the family and the child's symptoms and the caregiver symptoms, if needed be. For example, you are telling me that the mother died in a car accident and now he cannot tolerate looking at cars. That is because cars remind her or remind the child of the accident, and he cannot tolerate the grief and the fear. He thinks that is going to happen again. And so we need to give them the message that this happened once, and it's very rare that it will happen again, and that cars can be safe, and that we will use play, and we will use words, and we will use being together to think about what happened, how angry he is, how upset he is, how now he cannot fall asleep and does not want to go into cars, and that this is where we're going to play and talk and help him feel better. So that's what we call the child-parent psychotherapy formulation triangle. And we introduce toys to speak the unspeakable, which is to talk about the death, to talk about the fact that they want so much for the parent to come back and the parent cannot come back, to address pathogenic beliefs and to translate between parent and child. I think that very often parents, caregivers remove reminders of the dead parent. For example, put away photographs or put away things that the child associates with the parent. We encourage them to bring them back and to use books and photographs and everyday reminders. For example, a little girl used to clean furniture with socks, and she and her mother did that. And we brought socks into the therapy, and we would enact how nice it was to clean furniture with the socks and singing a song at that the mother and the child used to talk. So reenacting through rituals protective memories that keep the parent alive in the child's mind. When do we terminate treatment? When there is a new attachment that we feel can be protective, when the child is reconnected with age-appropriate activities, when the range of affect in the child's life includes playfulness and joy, and when the child can speak about the parent or show about that the parent is integrated in their sense of self. One of the things that children are afraid of is forgetting the parent. And that is why we try to bring into their everyday life memories of the parent and have conversations about the parent that are casually integrated into everyday life, so that the grandma or the father might say, that reminds me when you were 2 years old, you know what your mommy did when it was your birthday? Or you know what your mommy did when she took you to school? And then it keeps the memory of the parent alive. We have 5 randomized studies showing that children treated in this way have better cortisol regulation, a better cellular aging, less PTSD, less behavior problems, more IQ, better mental representation of the self and parent. And so we are very committed to a relationship-based intervention with grief and trauma in the first 5 years of life. Thank you very much.
Alicia, thank you so much for your part of the presentation. And I think that the work with the youngest one is the most challenging usually because of all the things that you have listed that we just don't speak the same language at times. They are on a different level of cognitive structuring that is for us it is difficult to tune into that, but the consequences of these events on the younger psyche, the brain are very important. So thank you so much for sharing this information with us today. And if you don't mind, and
Can I say one thing? I just want to
sure,
tell you,
sure.
can you please, children, the 2 games, hide and seek, right? And peekaboo.
Yeah.
Just that can really, really help. Because that is separation reunion, separation reunion. Just
Yeah.
so bring back your childhood to yourselves when you are facing a child, and that will help us.
That's a great advice. Thank you so much for that. If you don't mind, and if Julie don't mind, we still have some time for the possible discussion and answering the questions. So if any of our participants have any questions, we would have some time to discuss them now, all right? То, колеги, маємо ще кілька хвилин для питань. Якщо у вас є якісь питання до Аліші чи до Джулії стосовно переживання. Так, маємо одне. We have a question. Так, Серафимо, а ми з вами не на одному каналі, бо я наче на англійському. Так, і буду зараз зачитувати. No, вибачте, sorry, I'm confusing the channels with English and Ukrainian, so I'm switching to Ukrainian channel to read out the question in Ukrainian so that Serafima can translate. Так, вибачте, Серафимо, що вас заплутала і себе заплутала. Отже, Людмила Пянківська питає, дякує за презентацію, і питає, порадьте, будь ласка, як повідомити 6-річній дитині про раптову загибель його двоюрідного брата такого ж віку. Він був його найкращим другом. Чи доречно брати його на поховання і як про це запитати? Завчасно вдячна.
Alicia, I think do you want to answer that?
I'm sorry, I heard only the Ukrainian. I don't know what the answer, I didn't hear the question.
Sure, I can repeat it, I think. So the
What
question.
is the question? Is there in chat?
No, so the question was translated, but basically the question was, how would you advise telling a 6-year-old who that his father died suddenly?
Brother, cousin of the same age.
That his cousin died suddenly, and that and would you advise that he goes to the funeral?
That is such a big question. The way I would say to the 6-year-old is that the cousin died suddenly. And the most important thing is to be real with children. That's why we call it speaking the unspeakable. Children know much more than we think they know. They are constantly looking at adults and at other children. They're like little sponges that absorb everything around them. They listen to telephone calls, they listen to adults, they listen behind, they know what happened. I want to tell you a personal story that I had a death when I was little, and I was not told about it. And the adaptive part, as Julie says, is that this is what I'm doing now, speaking the unspeakable. But I wish I had been told what happened, because all the fantasies that I had about what happened were a real burden on my soul as a little girl and growing up. And I kept asking, and there were no answers. So talking directly to children about what happened and deciding what are details that are too difficult and waiting for them to ask, but when they ask, giving them real answers. And the question of whether to go to the funeral depends a lot on what the funeral will be like. And will there be somebody there that can pay attention to the child and explain to the child what is happening? There is value in going to the funeral many times because it gives them a sense of the finality of death, what happens to the body, and talking about the difference between the body and the soul in a way that responds to the spiritual beliefs of the family. And so it can be very helpful, but it needs to be developmentally appropriate in terms of providing supports for the child.
Thank you, Alicia, for your answer. Julie, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, as usual, Alicia explained it beautifully. I think the only thing I might add is that we have had, cases of children who were told that they were not allowed to go to the funeral, who later had what appeared to be a much harder time accepting the reality of the death. And so if there is an opportunity, as Alicia described, to have a supportive adult there who can sort of guide the child through that experience, we have found that it is typically more helpful than unhelpful to have the child attend the funeral.
And I just want to say there are religions where children under a certain age cannot go to the funeral. And in those cases, for example, we help them, we create a ritual of a funeral and help them bury a doll or an animal and say, this is what happens. Or we go to the garden and do it in the garden, so that there are ways of showing what happened.
Thank you, Alicia and Julie, for these answers. Alicia, I think I might know why you don't hear the translation. Could you please pick the interpretation channel as English on your menu? And that way, whenever I say something in Ukrainian, you will be hearing the translation in English. It looks like a little planet, or it might be under More in the menu. And then there should be an interpretation option.
Thank you. And I'm so sorry that I keep bringing things,
Don't
slowing
worry.
things. Under More, I have request permission to record captions.
Look for interpretation.
I don't have that option. I'm so sorry.
No, you don't have. Okay. Then it's fine. Don't worry. We will try to. Do you see a little planet as a
No.
button on your menu? No, and no
Oh,
interpretation.
here it is. Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you.
Yes, and switch to English, and
Yes.
then we will.
Thank you.
Perfect, and then you will hear the translation. We have a hand raised by Людмила Колісник. Людмила, будь ласка, ваше питання.
Dear colleagues, Julia, Alicia, thank you very much for the lecture. And I would like to ask about the form of work. I'm a psychologist with teenagers who's experiencing loss and grief. Is it possible, what do you think, is it possible to work online with teenagers of, for example, 12 or 13 years old? Is it worth to do so, or is it better to work just in the room, not online?
That's a great question. So just to repeat your question, you're asking whether it is helpful or useful to work with adolescents online virtually to do this kind of work.
Yeah. If there is no other possibilities, because, for example, now I have the inquiry and I'm thinking whether it's worth or not, or maybe just to work with the parent.
Yes. So we actually do teletherapy, so online therapy with kids starting at age 8 and up. I would say that the kids that are most engaged online tend to be kids ages 10 and up, but we have very successfully implemented the treatments that I talked about today, particularly, multidimensional grief therapy online. And I don't know if it's different where you are, but at least in the United States, kids are so accustomed to being online, using FaceTime, interacting that way, that it really actually doesn't seem to faze them. And in fact, I think sometimes having the computer screen there almost acts as a protective barrier, in the sense that sometimes because of the sensitivity of the material that they're talking to you about, having that one-on-one, face-to-face intensity in person can actually make it a little more difficult for them to open up. So we've found anecdotally that having them do the work online actually facilitates more open discussion and less distress.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the answer, for experience. Thank you.
I would like to add briefly that during the pandemic, we switched to online therapy. We had a donor give us laptops to give to family, tablets, iPads to give to parents. And we found that there were fewer sessions missed online than in person, and children really, because they were with a parent and because they were using toys, it was very effective to use it, and we have the same improvements, so that even with young children, if the therapist is comfortable, one can do that with young
Great.
children.
Thank you very much.
Дякую за ваші відповіді. Я зачитаю два наступних питання разом. Зараз тільки хочу перевірити. Аліша, чи ви чуєте переклад англійською зараз?
I am hearing you. It is in English here. So
Чудово. Чудово, чудово. Так, то маємо два питання, задам в одному, бо одне з питань, я так розумію, що пані Надія Шулюк запитує про те, що про частинку з доповіді пані Аліші, як можна допомогти дитині до 3 років, адже важко пояснити про смерть дуже маленькій дитині. То це так, якщо можна, короткі якісь поради до того, як говорити з дитиною про смерть до 3 років. І питання від Ніни Атаманчук: з якого віку можна брати дитину на поховання близьких? Дякую.
I want to say that we use small, short words to tell a 2-year-old that somebody died. And we say, the person died, something very, very sad happened. Something very sad happened. This person died. She cannot move, she cannot talk, she cannot eat, She cannot breathe. Her body broke and the doctor could not fix it. It is so sad. We are so sad. And I am here and I will take care of you. The more concrete we are for young children, describing what it means for the body to die, but then always offering a protective. I am here and we will play and we will talk and we will think of her. And then we take the child and we show photographs, or we make a drawing, or we sing. Always create a soothing. And I think what the most important thing in all therapies, and particularly with young children, is whenever we talk about something that is difficult and dysregulating, always pair it with a protective, loving, regulating, hopeful message. To give the message of there is tragedy, there is sadness, there is grief, and there is protection and love and hope, which is the human experience, really, is what keeps us going. About the age of the child going to the funeral, a lot depends on what will the funeral be like. Can there be somebody there for the child that will keep the child protected, regulated, who will pay attention to the child? And a lot depends on the beliefs of the family. What do you think, Julie? Would you say the same thing?
Yes, absolutely. And again, I think it really does go back to what you said earlier, Alicia, about having a supportive caregiver at the funeral itself, to be able to guide the child through that experience. And I loved your idea about in cases where it just doesn't seem possible to be able to simulate a funeral in the therapy room, I think is a wonderful idea.
Thank you both for your answers. I think they gave some really great insight into both of these questions, and the importance of the rituals. Yeah, like any routines, it's kind of like funeral being one of the routines that is helping us process. So I think that is also a very good idea, that we don't need to protect children from these funerals, but we need to engage them into the processing of the these events, the losses. Next question has been already dubbed by Gregory. Thank you very much, in English, so you can find it in the chat. I will read it in Ukrainian to the public. You will hear the translation, but also you can find the translation in the chat as well. Отже, Марія Лабенська дякує за лекцію, каже, що все дуже цікаво, і задає питання: якщо є група дітей, в яких один з батьків загинув на фронті або вважається пропавшим безвісти, як краще працювати з ними тільки індивідуально, чи групові заняття теж доцільні? Як краще сформувати атмосферу групових занять, щоб діти могли відкритись один одному та створити приймаючий простір? Які є нюанси серед різних вікових груп? Звучить як доволі обширне запитання, тому я думаю, що певні напрямки для самостійного дослідження, якщо нам зможуть підказати, це вже буде дуже помічним.
Alicia, I can start if you want.
Yeah, please do.
So, you know, we have had good success treating kids in group settings. What I would say is that the more similar they are in terms of their experience, the better in terms of forming groups. So I would not necessarily put kids together where there's ambiguous loss, where the person is missing, and kids who we know definitively have had the death of a loved one. We probably would not want to combine those groups. But if we can have one group that experienced an ambiguous loss, one group that experienced bereavement, we have found that kids ages 10 and up actually do quite well in group settings. Now, there are pros and cons to each. I would say in the group setting, one of the pros is that it is an amazing way to help validate the child's experience by being surrounded with other kids who have had a very similar experience. It validates and normalizes what they're feeling. And it also harnesses that social contract. So what we find is that it does not take a lot of coercing or pushing them to recognize that this is a sacred, safe space. You know, they often are opening up so much to each other that it is both spoken and unspoken that this is a safe space where they can tell each other, you know, some of the hardest things that they have in their hearts to talk about. So there's the positive side of that, and there are lots of activities that lend themselves well to a group setting. I would say when the death is incredibly traumatic and or contains gruesome or very disturbing aspects, it is often wiser to do that on a one-to-one individual therapy basis. Because what we don't want is to have other kids in the group hearing things that can also be traumatizing to them. So I would say that sometimes it's a little bit of a judgment call. We've also had kids where we're treating them individually and simultaneously they are in more of a peer support setting where they can be with other kids who've had a similar experience, but the actual crux of the therapy is happening individually. So I'll pause there. I don't know, Alicia, if you have other things to add to that.
I could not add anything. It was a beautiful answer. Thank you, Julie. I learned a lot from it.
Thank you, Julie, also, and sorry for keeping you a bit over the time limit, but we have one more question, if you don't mind, and it also has been already translated by Gregory. Thank you so much for that. So I will switch to Ukrainian to read it out. Так, отже, пані Катерина Понеділко питає, чи існують межі періоду горювання, так, я на правильному каналі чи ні? Так. Чи існують межі періоду горювання? Скільки часу триває процес горювання у дитини, чи є якісь рекомендації стосовно дуже довгого періоду горювання?
I can start, and then I'm really curious to hear what Alicia has to say about this. I would say that one of the myths or false statements that happen in our society is that there is a specific timeline for grief and mourning. We know that there is not, and in fact, grief is the natural reflection of the love we had for the person who died, the love we still have for the person who died. And so we don't expect grief to stop. What we do expect is that those waves of grief, the intensity of the grief, will come and go over time. And what we're really trying to do is give kids the coping tools to be able to help them with those waves of grief. But there is no point at which they should stop mourning. And in fact, you know, it often helps kids to validate their experience by letting them know we are always going to miss mom or dad. We are always going to have those feelings. Those feelings may feel heavier at times, and we have tools now that we can use to help with those feelings, but they're not going to go away, just like the love we have for the person is not going to go away. But Alicia, what else? Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you so much for your answers and for the presentations today. I thank all the participants for their great questions and for attendance, because I'm always very touched by the Ukrainian urge to learn and develop in various under various circumstances. So I'm really grateful to everyone attending this event today. And of course, our special thanks goes to Alicia, you and Julie. Thank you so much for the important topic, the way you covered it, and also all the wisdom and experience and heartfulness that you brought into this topic. It is very much appreciated. I hope that you probably don't understand Ukrainian, but I hope that you see all the messages that are coming in and all of those messages saying thank you so much. It has been a very important topic and beautifully covered. So I just join in with those voices. And also, I'm very thankful to Stephen and Gregory and Christian for being here today, and also for facilitating and making possible this meeting today. And special thanks goes to Serafima, our lovely interpreter today. She is doing an amazing job as always, and thanks to her, more people get to hear our wonderful lectures and learn from them. So thank you so much. I think this was great success, and I look forward to our future meetings. Thank you very much.
Wishing you safety and victory.
Thank
Bless
you.
you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
much.